Skeptics often ask, why won't God heal amputees? While I'm unaware of a limb growing out, there is one medically documented case of a regrown intestine. I'm talking about the curious case of Bruce Van Natta. Allow me to read a brief excerpt from Craig Keener's book, Miracles Today, The Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. Keener writes, one evening when Van Natta was working late, a jack gave way, and a nearly 50,000-pound truck's massive, half-foot-wide axle crushed his abdomen almost down to the concrete. Blood shot up into his throat, and soon he saw angels holding his body together. The first responders believed that he was dead for about 40 minutes. From his severed arteries, he should have bled to death in 10 minutes. His survival in any condition was medically unexpected. In fact, James Garlow and Keith Wall remark, subsequent medical studies drawing on cases from trauma centers around the world show that he is the only person ever known to survive such injuries. Despite Van Natta's survival, his abdominal damage was severe. Doctors repaired what they could, but most of his small intestine was dead or dying and had to be removed. His small intestine as a whole had only 121 centimeters left. A small intestine's average length is 600 centimeters. The crucial part of the intestine, the ileum, is normally 350 centimeters long. After his necessary surgeries, Van Natta had only 25 centimeters of his left. Unable to digest food properly, he began to decline. His weight dropped from 180 pounds to 125. At this point, one of his friends felt strongly led to fly from New York to pray for him. Now, with Van Natta in person, the friend commanded his small intestine to grow in Jesus' name. Van Natta felt something like an electric jolt in his body, and he was healed. In an adult, a small intestine can widen, but it cannot naturally grow longer. Yet a radiologist confirms that Van Natta's small intestine had more than doubled in length and was now fully functional. To do measurements more precisely than this, one would need to actually remove his small intestine and unwind it, which would naturally counter the point of the original miracle. But the previous surgeries and subsequent healing seem plain enough. I followed up with Van Natta, and he confirms that years later he remains healthy. Okay, so how have skeptics responded to this claim? The guys at Digital Gnosis have some thoughts.
Yeah, so that intestine regrowing case, I tried to look into that, but as you said, that one is not one they've published, so there's no documentation that I could find. One thing, and not being a medical doctor, but relying on, I have a biology degree, but not like a medical degree. So that's sort of general background plus the research that I do into these things. But it did seem to me that they said they relied on x-rays, and that's not the best way to image soft body tissue at the best of times. And one thing we do know is that I don't think you can regrow intestine. The lining of the intestine absolutely does regrow and is regularly replaced. So I was wondering whether there might have been a thickening and a healing of parts of the intestine subsequent to surgery, which perhaps didn't show up as well initially on whatever imaging technique that they used, and showed up a little better later, or possibly they even just did the scan slightly differently. And as you point out now, that the technique for measuring the length of the intestine is not really there anyway. This seems to me to be a sort of a natural explanation, that basically they observed a different length because of perhaps some natural healing plus the imaging technique not that reliable.
When they say that something like regrowing an intestine is impossible, I mean, as far as I read that, is that in the medical literature, there are no cases where you get significant regrowth of an intestine. But how many of those cases are as extreme as this guy surviving? And I could totally imagine a situation where the human body, under most circumstances, doesn't regrow something like an intestine, but then under like really large trauma, you do actually get some regrowth. I could easily see that sort of thing happening, and I think that happens even with some brain damage cases where, like, the neurons don't tend to regrow, but if you really have a lot of damage, you do get a lot of rewiring that happens. And so there are, at least, I mean, I don't know whether this is exactly plausible, but it seems like it's possible, and something that would make it harder to measure, obviously, but it could be just the fact that we have an extreme case, and that's pretty much it. So and then you combine it with the lack of proper technology to scan, other confounders in terms of the thickness or the original measurement or any of that stuff, then you really don't have a strong case to make, and even they can't make the strong case. I mean, they admit that they can't make that strong case.
Now, to set the background here, they're critiquing a conversation between Elijah Stevens, Craig Keener, and Michael Shermer on the Unbelievable YouTube channel. Stevens directed the documentary Send Proof. The film features several notable miracle claims and interviews with believers and skeptics, which include both Shermer and Keener. And indeed, the Send Proof team admit that they can't publish Van Natta's case. This is because they don't have the technology yet to get the accurate measurement of the intestine needed to verify the result. The current results are very suggestive, but they're not 100% conclusive. James Fedor and Brian Blaise throw out some possibilities that might explain what's going on, but I have to say they're not very convincing. They also seem to ignore the miracle claim's context. For example, they disregard Van Natta's out-of-body experience and the appearance of what he described as angels. They take no notice of the fact that Van Natta is the only person on record to survive with so many severed arteries and that he should have been dead in 10 minutes. Furthermore, a thickening of his intestines, as Fedor suggests, doesn't seem to provide an adequate explanation for his subsequent return to health. Van Natta was rapidly losing weight and his health was quickly deteriorating. Doctors tell us that people who lose more than 50% plus of their intestine will remain dependent on IV feeding and medications. The near complete removal of his ileum would also mean that he couldn't absorb B12, which would lead to lifelong diarrhea. Van Natta was on a combo of enteral and parenteral IV feeding. This feeding wasn't being digested well at all, and Van Natta reported that it would just pass right through him. All the weight that he had lost happened over a short period of 3 months. Van Natta reports that he now has normal digestion. The digital gnosis panel at least acknowledged the very small probability of Van Natta's recovery, but the problem is that they ignored the independent specialness of the event. Remember that Van Natta had a friend fly from New York to pray for him because he felt specially prompted by God. The man who prayed for Van Natta's name is Bruce Carlson. Carlson had only met Van Natta briefly earlier in the year. When he prayed for Van Natta, he testified to feeling something like electricity go into his body. Only after he was prayed for did Van Natta begin to recover. Positing some sudden rare regrowth under dire circumstances, as Blaise does, that we don't scientifically know about yet, seems awfully ad hoc. It should also be noted that Joel Lantz, the author of the book Bridges for Honest Skeptics, wrote to the CEO of the Short Bowel Syndrome Foundation asking about Van Natta's case. Dr. John A. Vanderhoof, the consulting gastroenterologist for the Short Bowel Syndrome Foundation, responded saying, "It, referring to the intestine, only gets longer if the surgery was done in a baby, not in an adult." So taking all these facts into account, there's more going on here than a highly improbable event. It's capable of being identified as a special occurrence besides the simple fact that it did in fact happen. These two factors together point to an intelligent agent behind the miracle. Allow me to illustrate. If a spouse dies in a car accident, even though her car was in good condition, she had a good driving record, and the driving conditions were excellent, would this be an accident or the result of some malicious act done on purpose? Given the conditions, it would be highly unlikely that the event would happen, so the probability of her death being an accident is very low. Even so, if that was all the information that we had, the accident could simply have been a sad, unlikely accident. It would be a different story if the car accident occurred right after the husband had taken out a large insurance policy on his wife, purchased 2 tickets to Tijuana for himself and his secretary, and the marriage was headed towards an ugly divorce. In this case, the low probability and it being a special situation independently of the fact that it happened could justify an arrest for murder. When evaluating miracle claims, we can't just look at the low improbability of the reported event. We know that the doctors removed a significant portion of Van Natta's intestine. We know by the best available means of measuring his intestine that it was estimated that he only had 20% length of a normal person's intestines, and we're aware that he only had an estimated 7% of the ileum, which is crucial for digestion. While it's true that these approximations shouldn't be taken as 100% certain, it seems very unlikely that they would be that far off, especially given Van Natta's symptoms. The low estimates are highly suggestive that he should not have survived barring divine intervention. These facts, combined with the fact that Bruce's recovery began when a friend flew out from New York to Wisconsin to pray for him after he felt a strong urging to do so, and that Bruce experienced some kind of physical sensation during the prayer, again is very highly suggestive. Bruce is currently healthy and active in ministry. His subsequent return to health after prayer made in the name of Jesus would be very surprising if naturalism is true, but not surprising if Christianity is true. Therefore, it's rational to believe that a miracle occurred here.